Hi, welcome everyone. If you're joining us from Facebook or Zoom, I hope you've all connected well. If you have problems, just leave a comment or in the chat and we'll try and fix it for you. I'm Amy from ISPOR KI Student Chapter, and I'm here with Carla and Camilla. And today we have a speaker who is in senior management at Syneos Health, Hedda Magnusson. Welcome, Hedda. She has 15 years experience in the field of clinical trials as a clinical research associate, clinical lead and project manager. Today, she's going to talk about pharma business and real world and late phase studies. The presentation from Hedda is going to last about 15 to 20 minutes, and it will be followed by a Q&A session, which will hopefully end around 5 to 1. If you have any questions, you can send them throughout the event or comment them on the Facebook Live, and we'll make sure that they're answered during the Q&A. So thank you, Hedda, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Oh, I'm talking on mute, sorry. Now you can hear me? Yeah, good. So just wanted to check you see one screen now and not the notes. Yeah, good. So I'm going to switch my video off so that you don't get too distracted by me and you can look at the slides, but I'm still here. So, okay. And I will just open my notes. Let's see. There we go. All right. So as already mentioned, today I will talk a little bit about pharma business, but with the main focus on real-world late-phase studies and clinical research. And thank you so much for that nice introduction about my background. Just a couple of words about who I am in general. So as you said, I've been working with clinical research and clinical studies since 2004, starting off as a CRA at a pharma company and then moving into the CRO business. And my background is a master in pharmacy, so I'm a registered apothecary in Sweden. And I've also had a couple of other courses and trainings, of course, as part of my job and as external courses throughout these years while I worked in the field. Beside my day job and beside my studies, I've also had a couple of positions of trust. So the first one when I was still a student was as a secretary of our of the board of our pharmaceutical student union here in Uppsala, and now I'm also a board member of the CRO business in Sweden, which means that I also am a member of the expert council for clinical studies at the industry association LEAF, and since about a year ago, I'm also part of the alumni group for the Faculty of Pharmacy here in Uppsala at the university. And why I wanted to mention that is just that try to remember that besides your studies and your degrees and everything, building your networks and your connections through these type of activities can also be a really beneficial way to get into the market and when you want to find jobs later on. So enough about me. Let's talk more about clinical studies. And I'm actually not going to talk a lot about the pharma business in general, but more about the studies run through pharma industry and pharma business. So if you want to learn more about that, feel free to reach out to me and we can set up another meeting or so. But just starting off with the definition then and the basics around clinical research before moving into real-world research. On the screen here you have the definition from the EU regulations, what a clinical trial is. So most of the research studies on drugs are clinical trials and not real-world or as we call them, non-interventional studies. I will go into all of these definitions in the slides coming up as well. The definition for clinical trials is very clear, and it's also incorporated in the local laws in Europe since it's come from the European directive. And as you can see here, for a study to be a clinical trial, there has to be an investigational product. And an investigational product is a drug that is not yet on the market. It hasn't received marketing approval for the disease you want to use it for when you study it. And that is one of the main differences actually between clinical trials and real-world research studies, because very often the real-world studies are studies on drugs that are already on the market and have their approval. So they would not be clinical trials, but they would be clinical studies or real-world research studies or non-interventional studies, or there are lots of terms. And that's also one thing to keep in mind, that clinical trials has a much more clear and a much more detailed framework and a regulatory background than the real-world research studies. So that is both a challenge, but it's also, of course, an opportunity and a way for you to conduct research and gather information on drugs on the market in a more flexible way, you could say. Right. So I think probably most of you know these things. I'll try and skip through them sort of quickly. As you probably know, clinical studies are often traditionally divided into different phases. You usually talk about phase 1 to phase 4, but there's also what we call phase 0, which is when you give really, really tiny doses to healthy volunteers. And this is something that have become a little more common after the issues that were seen in first-in-man studies. I think all saw in the news a couple of years ago where there were issues with severe side effects for some of the volunteers in the first-in-man studies in the UK. But phase 1 is then mainly healthy people, and you just want to check how the drug is sort of passing through the body and sort of look a little bit for therapeutic doses, etc. They're often small and fairly short. Same goes for phase 2, where you also do fairly small studies, but then you look at how the drug works in patients that have the disease that the drug is meant to be used for. Phase 3, you scale everything up, so you often have already knowledge about what dose you believe is the best, general knowledge about safety around the drug, etc. So this is the studies that you do before you apply for marketing approval. So you need a lot of data, and often you compare as well with other drugs already on the market. And then phase 4 are the studies that I will talk a little more about, which are on drugs that have marketing approval. So you're studying how they work in standard clinical practice, in larger groups of patients, and in also more varying populations. So how the drug works in real worlds, so to say. You can also divide clinical studies by looking at like the purpose of the study or the endpoints that you define. So instead of just grouping them into phases in the development of the drug. So this is just a couple of examples that are fairly common. Proof of concept, of course, is a very important study, often phase 2.
Hello, Hedda.
Yes, hi.
Sorry, I think we couldn't hear you.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yeah.
Has it been for long, or was it just now?
Just now.
Okay, good. Right. So, as I said, proof of concept is one of course, of the very important studies early on in phase 2. Safety is generally always part of studies, even if it's not the primary objective, but you always gather safety data, basically. And then looking at the real world studies, as I mentioned already, these are usually non-interventional or observational studies where you don't really intervene or change anything in how you treat the patients. You just collect data on what's going on and what drugs they receive and how their disease is progressing, etc. You also have the low intervention studies that are sort of in between clinical trials and non-interventional studies. And recently, actually, this was a new regulatory term in the EU directive that is showing a little more clearly how to work with these studies and how they can be set up and performed. Okay. So I'll move on. Yeah, this slide just shows you a little bit more over time, perhaps, where you do different types of studies. And what I also wanted to point out is that early on, when you are in phase 1 to around phase 3, the main objective of your studies is usually to gather data from a clinical objective to, as I say, define how the drug works, that it is effective in the way you want, and that it's also safe. So to balance that up and, and collect all this information. But once you move more towards your marketing approval, so the late phase 3 and phase 4, your objective of the studies becomes more of a commercial character. And with that, that doesn't mean that the studies are meant only to increase your sales. That is not what I mean, but what I mean is that you have to gather data that you need, for example, to get pricing and reimbursement in many countries. So this is something that has sort of arisen during the last decade or so, the requirements to provide data that supports your pricing and to be able to take part in the reimbursement systems. There could also be that when you get your marketing approval, there's a requirement connected to that. So you basically need to continue to do phase 4 observational studies to gather data. It is often about safety, long-term safety, and things like that. So that's something that we do see from the authorities, especially when you get a faster marketing approval for some drugs. So this basically just show you what I told you, that earlier on, you were doing all your clinical trials and then you get your marketing approval and that's it. Your drug's on the market and you can go ahead and sell it. But nowadays there are more requirements for further studies in phase 4. So it's a growing area and there are more types of phase 4 studies arising all the time, I would say. So what is a non-interventional study then? We also call them OR studies, as I said, observational research and real-world research studies, real-world evidence studies. There are many names. One definition, as you can see here on the screen, is that these are research studies conducted to confirm a drug's safety and effectiveness in the real world. So that is when the drug is used in routine patient care. So the difference then from a clinical trial is basically that you just follow the patients when they receive their treatments. You don't intervene with it, you don't change it because of the study, but you collect the data from their medical records and from what's going on, and that way you can get information on how the drug actually works when it's used out at the hospitals and in the real world, basically. So that's sort of the difference between effectiveness and effect. I'm sure that's something you've talked about. So yeah, let's move on. As I mentioned as well, it is a regulatory term, a non-interventional study, but the regulations around it are not very well defined and not very clear. I will come back to this. It is defined by the fact that you as I said, gather data from patients without really intervening with how they're treated. So it has to match your methodology and also your objectives that way. So the important things are then, of course, that the drugs that are prescribed to the patients are done according to routine care and in the usual manner. And it has to be, the choice of drug has to be separated from the choice of participating in these studies. The drugs are also always basically on the market. Also, let's see what's in the second. That's what I just said, yeah. So that's really, really important that all the clinics that participate in these type of studies, they first make their decision on how to treat their patients, and then they can also consider whether data can be collected for the study. So in this slide, I've just listed a couple of fairly common misconceptions around real-world research studies and non-interventional studies. As I mentioned, this area has grown quite a lot recently, and earlier on, I think the last one here, bullet 4, was a fairly common view of non-interventional studies, that they're mainly just hidden marketing activities. And that's not true, at least not anymore, because as I mentioned, there are regulatory demands, there are requirements for marketing approvals, and there's also the need to really understand what is, how is the drug working when it's used in real practice, and also what are the long-term safety data, as well as some of the rare safety data that you perhaps don't find from the clinical trials. Also, one misconception, the first one here, is that the non-interventional studies are not regulated at all, and that's not true. But one thing that makes it a little complicated is that the local requirements often differ among countries, so they're not the same throughout Europe. They're not as harmonized as for clinical trials. There's also a misconception that patients don't need to consent to taking part in non-interventional studies, and that's not true either. Almost all of these studies come with informed consent. There are some exceptions, but most of them do need patient consent. And they're all governed by the Declaration of Helsinki, same as for clinical trials. And also, there's a belief often that as soon as you have any type of intervention added, a non-interventional study would become automatically a clinical trial, and this is not true either. You can add, for example, questionnaires, and in some cases even clinic visits or collection of samples, but it has, these additional activities have to be separate from the regular treatment of the disease that the patients have. So that's the important thing. This is maybe a little tricky to balance, but if you add a questionnaire, for example, it does not automatically mean that you have a clinical trial. So I think one way to understand the real-world research studies compared to standard clinical trials is just to compare them. So I'll do this in a couple of slides, and maybe that will help. So the first one here shows actually what are the similarities between clinical trials and non-interventional studies. So as I mentioned, they're both governed by the Declaration of Helsinki, which is, I mean, the basic ethical framework for all clinical research. You need to have ethic committees reviewing these studies, also the non-interventional studies. And also you have to have a study design that is outlined in like a study protocol to follow, so that everybody is doing the same and data is collected in a similar way. And as I mentioned already, almost always the participants need to consent to participating in these studies. If we look more closely on clinical trials compared to non-interventional studies, since we have investigational products that are not yet approved to be on the market, of course, there's a higher risk for the participants and for the patients if they are on the studies. There could be more things that you don't know about the drug and how it works, of course. Usually there are also alternative treatments, and you interfere with what type of treatment the patient may get. There could be randomization between two treatment arms, for example. And the regulations for these trials are much more detailed, both within Europe and in the US, and basically in the whole world compared to the non-interventional studies. So looking more closely at the non-interventional studies, some typical features are that, as I mentioned, the risk is lower. The patients are treated in line with standard care, so you don't change that. The drugs are approved and on the market, so there is already lots of information known about the drugs, of course. And as I mentioned, then the decision of what treatment to give is separate from participation. So it could be focused on, for example, compliance and to gather data for safety, etc. So on this slide, you can just see some other comparisons between the clinical trials and the non-interventional studies. So as I mentioned, the regulations for clinical trials are global, they're harmonized, they're more detailed, and the studies are based on ICH GCP. You do not need to follow ICH GCP for non-interventional studies, but there are other frameworks and ethical guidelines that you need to follow in addition to Declaration of Helsinki. But as I mentioned, it varies. It varies between countries, and it also varies depending on what type of non-interventional study you're running. So it makes it a little more complex, but it also gives you more flexibility. Also, as I mentioned already, one major difference is, of course, that the drugs are not on the market for clinical trials, but they are for non-interventional studies. It's more difficult to do comparative studies when you do real-world research. It happens, and it can be often maybe secondary objectives or so, but almost never you have comparison as a primary objective for a non-interventional study. There's basically no randomization, there's no blinding of non-interventional studies, which is very common, especially randomization is almost standard for clinical trials. And that is, of course, to avoid bias of your data interpretation and your inclusion of patients in different groups. But since you don't intervene with the choice of treatment for non-interventional studies, you don't need to do randomizations. Okay. This slide I wanted to show just to point out, as I mentioned, for real-world studies, there are more choices, more types, and maybe more things to consider when you choose your design. It's more straightforward for clinical trials. There are very detailed guidances on what type of study to do before you have your marketing approval, and depending on where you are in development of a drug. But for real-world research studies, this varies a little bit, and it's often based on what your endpoints are, what you're trying to show. So I will not go into these in detail. It's not my area of expertise. Usually it's the biostatisticians and also epidemiologists and those roles that work on these things together with the regulatory experts for late phase. I think I am going to run over time if I keep on in this tempo, so I'll try and be quick. Just shortly, I wanted to mention the Pragmatic clinical trials, which I already said are sort of in the middle between randomized clinical trials and non-interventional studies. And this slide shows you sort of what's common and what's not with each type. And for EU, with the new regulations, there is a definition of these pragmatic trials and how they are to be performed and submitted, etc. So there's more guidance around these now, and it's a new term that you can use. Just quickly mentioning a little bit more about the laws and regulations. Here I'll try to list the most important ones that apply to both clinical research, clinical trials and non-interventional studies. So with a focus on Sweden here, as you can see. And the ones are highlighted in red, they are also applicable for non-interventional studies, and the ones in white are only for clinical trials. So as you can see, there are more for clinical trials. I think we all are very well aware that GDPR came into effect some time ago in May 2018. And I just wanted to mention this because especially, I would say, for real-world research and non-interventional studies, you have to really be thorough around GDPR, since what you do is basically collect data from patients and then you have to be sure that you follow these new guidelines correctly. There are also, as I mentioned, some studies where you don't even collect informed consent from patients because data is de-identified or it's on a group level, etc. And of course, then it's even more important to make sure GDPR is followed. So this was my last slide around studies and real-world research. I will now just show a couple of slides around my work and my role as a project manager. So I'm trying to look at the time. We are running over a little bit, so I'll again try and be quick. This slide can maybe be a little scary. It is actually, to me, sometimes still scary to think about what I do as a project manager. You are really the spider in the web and the main point of contact for all different groups and experts working on your studies, as well as the sponsors or the owners of the drugs that you are working on. And this is the same for real-world research as for randomized clinical trials. On this slide, I just listed a couple of things that I do in my daily work. So as I said, I am the main responsibility, the main responsible person for my studies. So I'm the one that are reporting both internally, externally. I have budget management as an important task, of course, to make sure that we follow the budget for the studies. But I'm also, of course, responsible for making sure the team is trained and that the clinics that participate are trained. I'm the main contact for any issues or for information needs. There are lots of meetings and conferences and email, of course, and Excel, especially these days when we can't meet face-to-face. So it's a varying job. You're never bored. You have lots of things to do, and you get to meet a lot of different people and experts. This slide shows you a number of different types of positions that you can hold working in clinical research, both clinical studies and real-world research studies. So just wanted to point out the ones there with red font, that these are usually positions that you start with if you don't have any experience within the field. So as a CRA or monitor, or as a project assistant, administrator of projects, working together with the project manager. On this slide, you can see a number of potential employers when working within clinical research. So of course you have the pharma industry, but I think we are all aware that there's been a shift over the last like 20 years or so, where lots of the work is now done by the contract research organizations in the middle here. So a lot of the positions that I showed on the last slide are within the CRO companies. And you can either work within a CRO or from a CRO outsourced to a pharma company. Of course, you can also work within the healthcare system or the academia, the regions in Sweden with clinical research. You can work at a biotech company. This is also a very much growing market because they have new regulations where all medical devices that are inserted or in some way interact with the human body have to be documented basically the same way as drugs. And of course you can work at a pharmacy that manage investigational products as well as the competent authorities. So in Sweden we have the Medical Products Agency here in Uppsala, where you can work with clinical trials and clinical studies. And finally, you can of course work at companies that do distribution of drugs and investigational products. And how, if you want to work within this field, how do you do, what is the trick to get a job? So just shortly, of course, your basic education from university is sort of must. Usually there's a requirement for a type of degree within natural science in different ways. So I just listed a couple here. Also, there are some additional trainings and courses that you can take. There's one here in Uppsala on clinical drug development specifically. I'm sure you have a couple where you are at KI and the course you are taking as well. There are courses within the Swedish Association of Pharmaceutical Sciences, that's Läkemedelsakademin in Swedish. And of course, if you have continued to do research and have a PhD or other types of research diplomas, that opens doors to some of the higher positions within clinical research. Of course, if you have any type of work experience, if you have had jobs over summers or similar, or if you've done international work, that is also beneficial for you. In addition to applying for positions that are open at companies, you can most often just submit your CV to companies, even if they don't have anything at the moment, and they would keep it. You could also try and get a project at a company, like a master thesis or similar. And as I mentioned in the beginning, to build your networks and to get contacts within the field is of course very helpful. If you can find mentors from your university or your research, that is of course something that can help you find jobs. There are also a lot of recruitment companies working to find good people for positions within clinical research at both CROs and pharmaceutical companies. So I just listed a couple here. If you have a profile on LinkedIn, you might also be contacted by them if they think you're appropriate. So that is also some advice to make sure that your profiles on social networks like LinkedIn is updated and looks good. So that was my last slide. I think I ran over a little bit, so I'm sorry about that. But here you have my contact details. Feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in working on clinical trials, or if you want to ask about anything around this that I just talked about. I could speak about clinical trials, I think, for days if I had the possibility, but we had a limited time here, so I just tried to summarize the most important. And finally, as it says here on the slide, if you want to work with this, it's very, I think, very rewarding. It's very interesting, and always you learn new things, and the environment for clinical trials is always changing, so you have to follow the flow. So just take the leap and jump into the water is often a good approach. So thanks. That was my last slide. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Hedda. That was a really interesting talk. We just have only a couple of minutes left for the questions. So if any of you watching at the moment have anything you want to ask, you can just unmute yourself or put it in the chat. So Hedda, from me, how would you sell your job? What's the thing that kind of gets you up in the morning to enjoy it?
Yeah, I mean, bottom line is really that I get to work on trying to improve treatments for patients and the drugs that we have and that we use. So to gather more information about this and improve the healthcare. I mean, that's what I'm coming from in the background. But then in my daily work, what gets me up and enjoying my work is, as I mentioned, it's very varying. I get to work with a lot of different experts and people that are very knowledgeable, and I learn new things every day. I usually have a plan of like, today I'm going to do this, this, and this, but then things come up and there are new problems to solve or other things that become urgent. So it's never boring. It's the opposite, I would say.
Yeah. Sounds interesting. And what would you say are kind of typical challenges that you're facing at the moment? I'm thinking.
Yeah, if we talk specifically about the real world studies that I work on, I think one of the challenges that we always sort of deal with is the fact that the regulations and the frameworks are not as clear and defined as for clinical trials. You have to make sure that your data is of good quality and that it's possible to analyze in a useful way, although you have these populations with very differing patients, and there might be a data set with lots of missing data, etc. So that's a challenge, and of course the data work is maybe more for the biostatisticians to manage, but you have to consider it also as a project manager and how you work with your teams and your clinics to get the data as good as you can.
Thanks a lot. I think we're basically out of time now. So I think if we have any further questions, anyone? Okay, one from the chat very quickly. What's your involvement with health economists and what's their role? When do they come into your projects?
They could come in at different points. I mostly work with people that I call epidemiologists, but they're often also health economists, and they can be involved in choosing what type of study you want to run, how to like design your protocol, what data to collect to show different types of endpoints. And they're also involved then in when you come to the point to analyze the data and to summarize it and write the reports, to draw the conclusions. Could also be to prepare reports or submissions for reimbursement, of course. So when you use the data coming out of the studies to submit for reimbursement, then the health economists are of course involved.
Okay, I think we're really out of time now, so we'll let you go.